Hello, BookTube. It is Saturday afternoon, and it's been a bit wet here. The temperature has dropped a little bit in the UK, at least where I am. It's been sort of drizzling and a bit of rain, so it's nicely below sort of, we've been having upwards of 30 plus degrees Celsius, which was it's anywhere from 90 to 100 Fahrenheit. And then it's inside here, it's about 10 degrees warmer. So it's still warm at the moment. I still need the fan on, but it's going in the right direction. I've had an odd week. I'm here to do a tag today, but it's been a very odd week work wise and everything in with the heat. I've been sort of reading sporadically. I've been going through pulling out some of my old penguins, and I've been reading little bits and pieces from things like African myths of origin. This was published. Well, it's Penguin Books from. Oh, I don't have a very good light here now. 2005, I think it is. This one and a few other things. Scottish folk and fairy tales from Burns to Buchan. Again, this is Penguin, 2008 or about, I think. And I picked this one up. I just sort of saw this today because I've had it for a little while. I did a little spurge of Penguin buying about, I guess it was late last year, I think it was. There was a bunch of stuff that was a little lower price, and I just sort of stuck them in a pile, and I just haven't bothered with them much. And this one, been sort of thinking about is the Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Reveries of a Solitary Walker, and they're just sort of little essays while they're walks, like first walk, second walk, and I this morning read the introduction, so that was kind of interesting, and I think I might go into reading a little bit of this. Been watching things on videos and on Amazon Prime, and I've just sort of been finding it interesting. Like I'm watching stuff that I normally wouldn't, like little thrillers or police procedurals, but I always find it funny watching a show where an archaeologist shows up, and it's supposed to be somebody who's very experienced. And the most recent thing I was watching, they were using trowels, but garden trowels. It's just clearly the writer, and they didn't even pull anybody in. Like they just pull anybody who has, a teeny bit of knowledge about archaeology, and they could have done a lot better. But obviously there were budget constraints, so they just thought, oh, a trowel, yeah. Well, so I use a garden trowel, so that's what we use. And the excavation techniques, and it was just, yeah, no, it's funny, and then I love it how they sort of dump things down too. It's like the archaeologist spouts these things about occipital fracture or something like that, and then the police officer goes, "Oh, you mean blunt force trauma?" And he's, "Oh, yeah, yeah, that's the thing." And then somebody else says, "Oh, so you mean he was hit in the side of the head near the eye?" Yeah, and they're surprised. Like, dumb it down 3 times. Anyway, let's get to the tag, the reread book tag. I have not been tagged in this for some reason, but it's originally done by Roz at Scallydandling about books, and there are 9 questions, so let's get to it. Number 1, let's assume you do reread if you're doing this tag. So where do you sit on the rereading scale, from almost never to all the time? Somewhere in between that, I suppose. There's books that I do have a set that I do reread periodically, and there's ones that I have in my mind that, oh, I'd like to reread that someday, that I read a long time ago. And I've got a fair few that I do reread on a fairly consistent basis, and then there's other ones that I'll, as I say, will pick up occasionally and reread, and then the ones thinking I'd like to actually reread that sometime. And number two, has that changed over your reading life? Um, I suppose so. Like, because now there's things that when I first read it, I never would have thought, well, I'd like to reread that again sometime. But as you know, I've read other stuff, and then I hear about this again, and I go, yeah, I'd like to maybe reread that. So that has changed because there's more time between when I originally read it. So that has changed. But the core ones that I reread have not really changed. There's been a few that have been added to it, but over time, but not my sort of rereading habits. I don't think have changed. Um, Number three, when do you reread? Maybe immediately after finishing a book, or not till years later, or when the mood strikes. Uh, all the above, basically. What's the first one here? Maybe immediately after finishing a book. Well, I don't really read. I've never, I don't think, reread a. No, that's a lie. Occasionally for school things. When I remember when I was in school, we were given a book, so I'd reread it really quickly. Usually that evening we were given it because they were usually short books, like 200 some pages long. So I would stay up late and read it, and then I would probably read it as we would go on. So I would reread it immediately after. It wasn't sort of done out of pleasure. It was just to do better on the course. Um, and there are times when I will reread bits of a book again immediately after, or an essay or short story shortly after, something like that, because it sort of impressed me, or I think I missed something in that, and then reread it. And a lot of times, sometimes like now, I'm thinking it's years later, because years later to reread some things, because I am picking up stuff occasionally that I read a long time ago and rereading, or thinking of rereading those. Then the mood strikes. Yeah, that definitely happens. But there are set times that I do reread certain things. Christmas Carol, for I don't know for how long now, a decade more, maybe 2 decades, I've been reading pretty routinely every Christmas. Usually Christmas Day or something like that is Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. And I would say for the last 5 years or so, I reread, not in their entirety, but I reread some anyway. Every October is M.R. James's Ghost Stories. So probably every 2 years I'll have reread all of them. And I've got some new Penguin editions. I think they're annotated ones, so I'm gonna dig into those. Let me see if I can reach them here. I think there. Oh shit! I just lost a book that I might not be able to reach, and it could very well be. Yes, it probably is an M.R. James one. Ah, fantastic. Okay, yeah. So there's one of them. The other one, I don't know how I'm gonna reach it. It might be easier just to buy a new one. But anyway, yeah. So this is Penguin. It's an annotated one. So they're split up there. I think there's what are there? 1, 2, 3, 14 or 15 stories in each. So theoretically, I could read one a day. But it's got notes, so I thought that would be kind of interesting to do. Um, those are probably, yeah, the set ones that I reread. Like, I try to do it every year. Sometimes for the Dickens, for at Christmas, I have not read it. I don't think I was able to read it last year for whatever reason. So sometimes I don't reread it. Um, but it is a set routine for me in many ways. Um, Number four, why do you reread books? Um, It's sort of like it's just sort. It's many ways the same reason I rewatch films, and there's a core of films that I rewatch every so often, and it's because I really enjoy, like, for films it would be I enjoy the direction, the story, the actors, the dialogue, and things like that. And for a book, it's the same thing, it's same but different. It's because I like the story, I like the characters. It could be I like the dialogue, and I find it in regardless of the reason for those for film or whatever, I find it comforting just to read, just to sink back into to characters that I'm familiar with, to a world that I'm familiar with, and just sort of leave everything else behind. Um, and I can get and indulge and many times see when I reread it, I see something else. I'm maybe in a different frame of mind when I reread it, and I see a different aspect, or I try to reread it from a different aspect. Um, it's like one that I really like. I've It must have been like 35, almost 40 years ago that I first read it. Was Henry David Thoreau's Walden. I read it because it was considered all like philosophical and everything, and I read it and I go, I never really cared for it that much. Like, it was like there was just the reason I was reading it to try to get some other aspect of it didn't actually fulfill me. But I liked the writing, and there were descriptions of things that I really enjoyed. I like there's a scene where he's digging in his garden, and he digs up an arrowhead, and being archaeology, like, being in archaeology, that's sort of I found interesting. So I reread it again, probably within a couple years or 3 years later. It was at the behest of somebody else because they were reading it as well, and I read it from that other aspect, and I thoroughly enjoyed it because I just sort of threw out all this other stuff that is seen and supposed to be seen in it, and I just put those aside, and I just enjoyed it for the descriptions, the language, that he was writing, and the situation. So yeah, that's why I reread, I suppose. I think it comes down to comfort and familiarity with things, and but always surprised to see new things in it. Number five, how do you reread? Faster, slower, just the best bits. Um, I don't think I read any faster or anything. I might even reread it a bit slower at times. It depends on what it is. Poetry, the poetry that I reread, I probably reread that slower, and I might even read it out loud at times. Um, and just the best bits. Well, yeah, I suppose so. Occasionally, with an essay or short stories in a collection, I might just reread a specific short story, um, and I do that with sort of Sherlock Holmes. I was um, I was saving Sherlock Holmes one time for because I didn't want to read everything because I felt that if I read everything, well, I was right. If I read everything, I would not have any new Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes stories to read. I would have to read. I would have read them all, and I did. And I did that because when I first came to England here and I started working here, the library didn't have anything. I didn't have any money to really buy much, but I did get the interlibrary loan, sort of two little collections. I've shown one that I've bought since. It's the short stories, and then there's the novels. So I was able to get those through an interlibrary loan, and because they were for a short period of time that I had them, I read it from cover to cover, each one sequentially. And some of those were a bit of a reread as well. But now I will reread some short stories occasionally, and I have reread like The Hound of the Baskervilles again. There's a few that I haven't reread on a continuous basis, but it was basically I didn't want to read everything. I do that with Edgar Allan Poe. I have not read every short story of Edgar Allan Poe yet. Occasionally, I will will read something new because I do not want to finish it. I do not want to finish it right now because I want something new to come back to. New in the sense that I haven't read it, it's a new discovery for me, and I hold back on that. And but then there are ones like I will open up and I love reading uh, the Some Words with a Mummy. I reread that every so often. I love that story. Fall of the House of Usher. I'll reread that occasionally. Um, what is it? What is it? Case of Monsieur de Valdemar, or however it's pronounced. And there's a few others that I will reread that I have read, but I've held back on reading everything. So and then those sometimes those going back to the other question of is when the mood strikes me, and that can happen, and I'll pick up. Oh, I haven't read Some Words with a Mummy for a while, and I'll reread that. And it's sort of the same too with uh, um, well, I guess I'm delving now into question six. Who or what do you reread more specifically? Okay, let's get into that now. And yeah, um, Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes stories, P.G. Wodehouse. That I can reread because I haven't reread for quite a while. I've got a cabinet here. You can't really see it so much, but it's in behind there. You can see it sort of there in the cabinet. There's books piled up in front here, in front of it. But there's a cabinet. It's made for dishes or displaying uh, plates and so forth. But I've got the whole Everyman Woodhouse, every volume, and I've read all his stuff. There might be a few that I haven't read, and I'm not sure because I've never kept a list. But he's great for rereading because it's the same plot every time, but I read it for the language, the how funny it is, and especially the Jeeves and Wooster stories. I'll be rereading those eventually until I die, I'm sure, and I'll probably get back into rereading them shortly. What else? As I say, Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, Edgar Allan Poe, but that's a continuous thing. I reread some of my favorite science fiction, City by Clifford D. Simak. I read that every so often, and there's a few stories like Huddling Place I reread separately, pull out from it, and I reread that, and I sometimes reread the introduction as well separately. Dune I reread every so often, the Dune books by Herbert. Foundation series, especially the trilogy. But I have reread the whole. Like there's 14 books that start out with the robot short stories, all the way up to sort of, I think Foundation and Earth is. I'm not sure, I can't remember now. Foundation and Earth I think is the last book. But there's about 14 books in total, and I've reread the cycle I think 3 or 4 times, but I've read individual ones like the robot books. Some of the robot short stories I really enjoy. I'll reread those, and I reread the trilogy as well. And then there's the Hyperion Cantos. I'll reread that every so often. I haven't read that too many times. I read it about maybe 3, 4 times, I guess, in total. But it is something that is on a reread sort of cycle for me. Something that I will reread. And there's just other books. There's essays. Just I can't even think of to list them. But there is one book of essays by A.C. Benson called From a College Window. I guess over 30, 35 years, I must have read it 6 or 7 times at least. I keep picking it up every so often, and I will read it from cover to cover. I will read an essay or two. I can't really explain how, but it's just there's just something I really like about that series of essays he did. Um, Dracula, I keep rereading every so often. I read about 4 times, maybe. Um, and that's another one where I keep seeing something different in it all the time. I keep seeing things that I think are subtle that Stoker has done, and I really enjoy that. And as I say, I reread Dickens, um, Christmas Carol every year pretty well, and M.R. James's ghost stories. There's Yeah, I'm just trying to there's a lot of things I reread, and it's sometimes off the top of my head I can't think because there's ones that I've only reread once. Um, there's essays of Orwell that I go back to all the time. Um, as I say, other science fiction that I've reread. Well, I mentioned Dune. Something I would like to reread again that I have. Well, I haven't actually completed the series. It's the Swinburne, Burton and Swinburne sort of mysteries. It's steampunk. Um, just forgot off the top of my head who wrote it, but I haven't read it through completely yet. But when I do complete it, I'll probably start at the beginning and reread at least that once again because I do like it. Another series that I would like to reread off the top of my head, science fiction, is the Riverworld series by Philip Jose Farmer. I've only read that through once. I would like to read it again, and it might become a reread every so often as well. Um, sort of nonfiction history books comes up many times. It's been showing on a few of the Mark Richardson and Jason Byways in Bookland is C.W. Saram's God's Graves and Scholars. I've read that many times in the past. I haven't read it probably for 25 years, a good time, but I'm itching to reread that. And there's a few other things, other history books. There was a more recent one. Judith Fellows did a book on London, sort of Victorian London, a Victorian city. It was Dickens's London, and I really enjoyed that. And that was something that I probably would like to reread again. But yeah, it's almost endless. But let's go on. Seven. Is there a book that you found better when you reread it? Um, Most I think I do because I see if it is something that I really like the first time, I see more depth in it, and because I know the story and I know what's going to happen, I can sometimes look at the foreshadowing or little hints that are put in that sort of really then make sense because you know where they're going and you can see how it's crafted. The author has crafted it, and then sometimes at the same time you see, oh well, he didn't craft it that well at this, doing this. So it's a little bit of both. Um, Anyone that was worse? Can't think of anything that was worse on the second reading. Um, well, I suppose because I had to read it was Wuthering Heights. I read that twice, and because it was part of a class thing, and I didn't like the first time, and I liked it less the second time, but read that fairly quickly in between. But generally, if I think it's something that I want to reread, I have not really found something that I liked less than I did the first time. Which one book have you reread most times? That is really difficult. I suppose it would probably be like I've probably read the Christmas Carol probably the most times. I would say I've it's coming up to probably at least 10 or a dozen times, and I don't think any of the others have come to that. I think I'm getting close to 10 on a few things, but probably yeah. Christmas Carol. It's like the my favorite version of it is Scrooge. It's 1952 with Alec Guinness. Um, is the favorite version of it, and I'll rewatch that even every Christmas. Like there are things that I do in films, as I mentioned. But anyway, there it is. That's 25 minutes long, and that's quite long for this tag. But thanks, Roz, for creating it. And I have another tag. There's another tag that's sort of, I think it's 10 questions of a nosy tag that Bill Rutenberg resurrected. So I'll be doing that later. Anyway, have a good weekend, BookTube.